So, as I say, when I started researching this project, Disaster in American History, what I really expected to find was that American culture and society was engaged in massive denial every time a disaster happened. And how could you have a nation that defined itself in terms of progress, a certain amount of optimism, forward movement, and so forth? How would it deal with devastating moments of failure, devastating disasters, and so forth? And so when I set about researching individual disasters, the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, the Chicago fire of 1871, and so forth, I kept expecting to come across this sort of this massive denial about what disaster means about America. What I discovered by contrast was that the disasters actually were very quickly picked up upon by dominant sectors of society as evidence for all that was best in some ways about America. That these were really quickly adopted as moments of opportunity. And in fact, that through the ways in which disasters were narrated, an ideology of progress was constructed, that disaster became a moment that cleared away opportunity for urban renewal, for political reformation, for religious self-renewal, whatever it happened to be. That disasters became these moments that were imagined as these opportunities for tremendous improvement. And what I'll do here is perhaps give you 4 or 5 sort of quickie little moments to try to put flesh on that statement. Even going back to 1676, there was a little fire in Boston in 1676. Increased Mather, the Puritan divine of that time, who some of you are perhaps familiar with, was confronted with a problem. And how do you deal with the fact that a disaster like this happens in a city in which you live? Mather was one of those people who kept talking about, as Puritans often did, that if we keep on sinning, then disaster will come and punish us. Turns out that his church and his house were among the first buildings destroyed in this big fire, and this presented him with something of a PR problem, I suppose, in 1676. And to be fair to him, he thought deeply about these questions. He troubled over this, and he came to certain conclusions. One, which is that, well, I'm a good guy. God has afflicted me in some ways, therefore, and God likes me, so therefore this must be a blessing in some ways. And he sought to set out the terms in which a disaster like this might be a blessing. And essentially it turned out to be a blessing for him in the sense that it was a correction. It was an opportunity provided by God to get people to think about who they were, what their society was like, and to make certain types of reforms in order to make themselves more righteous, more virtuous, and so forth. And this begins to set up a kind of a narrative tradition, I suppose, a way of dealing with disasters, which converts it very quickly from sort of punishment into an opportunity. And what's very interesting about that too is that Mather himself not only viewed it as a spiritual opportunity, but also as an economic opportunity. He took the opportunity to build a bigger, better house, and to build a bigger, better church, and so forth. And so very quickly, there was this sort of collision between spiritual renewal and a kind of economic urban renewal. That there was a sense in which, there really is opportunity here for some people. Of course, Increase Mather was one of the wealthier members of that community, and so that this was an opportunity that could be seized upon by those who had the most opportunities. And the city of Boston itself sees this opportunity to build wider thoroughfares and to renovate the city and turn it from a rickety little city into a slightly less rickety city with slightly wider thoroughfares, which were good for commerce and enabled Boston to capitalize upon sort of the commercial revolutions of the 18th century and actually to become quite a prosperous seaport. So very early on in American history then, there's a way in which religion, urban renewal, political reformation, and so forth come together and help to seal this narrative whereby disaster becomes an opportunity, and also therefore becomes a way to imagine how progress might operate. that progress is that when bad things happen, that becomes the impetus to move forward to a better world. By the time you get to, say, a huge disaster, and I'm jumping forward about 150 years here, like the Chicago fire of 1871, many people in positions of influence, political influence, economic influence, religious influence, by that point have become conditioned to treat a disaster as a tremendous opportunity. Never really takes off, and it's this narrative which has been so entrenched in American history just fails at the moment of Katrina, and that provides a starting point, I think, for a very interesting series of conversations. Why has that failed? And one way of looking at it, which I think was the dominant way of looking at it, was to say that this narrative fails us because it reveals that free market capitalism and so forth can no longer provide for the society. It produces racial divisions and social collapse and infrastructural decay and so forth. And Katrina is that moment that provides us with this opportunity to address those kinds of problems here. So one way in which Katrina might be written about in the future is precisely that moment of insight, where we suddenly realize that everything was going wrong. Unfortunately, however, I just read Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine. I don't know how many of you have read this book here, which puts a very different spin on this whole debate. Very quickly, she essentially argues that at this particular moment in time, disasters remain extremely lucrative for certain sectors of the economy, but it's sectors of the economy who aren't really very much interested in the welfare of the people as a whole, or progress more generally, or in community, but nevertheless see crisis as a tremendous opportunity for profit. And that you have a whole apparatus, a sort of security apparatus, private security apparatus of companies that really depend upon disaster in order to advance themselves. And she just gives a couple of examples, and I'll end up with a list of the things that she says happened after Katrina, which points to a bleaker narrative that might perhaps open up questions for us here. What she says essentially is that there was this moment when it seemed like free market capitalism might be exposed by Katrina, but in some ways that Katrina might end up being the best friend of a certain type of corporatist state here, and she points out all of the ways in which the usual suspects begin to benefit from Katrina. Halliburton, for example, gets a lot of money from the government to rebuild military bases. Our good friends at Blackwater are hired to protect FEMA from all of these looters that are supposedly running around. Bechtel gets the no-contract bids to build mobile homes. Billions of dollars in no-contract bids get sent out to friends of the Bush administration, and it becomes a tremendous opportunity for them. So it's possible then, as a conclusion, and this is the question that I'm left with, and I'm really not sure quite what I think is going to happen at this point, but it's entirely possible that we've simply moved into a very different time from, say, the time when the Galveston Plan might have been possible. That we might have moved, Naomi Klein suggests that we have moved into a society in which disaster is so lucrative for some very influential sectors of the private sector and the government and so forth, that they don't really want to repair cities like New Orleans, or they don't really want to have progress as imagined in terms of prosperity, community, and so forth. That these might actually be the kinds of events, disasters, that are welcomed and perhaps created by what Klein calls the corporatist state. So with that rather bleak conclusion, I guess I suppose our plan is to open this up to the floor. Is that right, Larry?
Sure. I thought maybe, thank you, Kevin. I thought we would just